Dr. Lucas, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Great.
Okay, and you can hear me fine?
I can. I can't see you.
Oh,
Do you
here I
want?
am.
Okay.
Now
I
you
can't
can see me.
I sure can. Let me get my video. Okay. Long time no see.
Yes, yes.
Welcome. Welcome
Thank
to
you.
the IDeA-CTR seminar series. We are excited to have your presentation today. So I think if it's okay, I'll go ahead and if you want to get your slides ready, you can, and we can help you, but I'll go ahead and introduce you so we can get started. There may be some people that dwindle in, obviously, as you know,
Sure.
with Zoom. That happens frequently, but anyway, today Dr. Lucas is going to talk to us about the psychedelic assisted treatment of psychospiritual distress. Dr. Lucas is an associate professor of palliative medicine and neurological sciences at UNMC, and the chief of palliative medicine at Nebraska and Western Iowa VA. Originally, she was a family doctor. She migrated to palliative care when the field was new and is now leading a push for what she describes as panadelic health, which is relieving suffering by revealing the mind. She became interested in psychedelics for palliative medicine after being a participant in a clinical trial of psilocybin for spiritual development at Johns Hopkins University in 2012. She is the PI for a new study of psilocybin for cancer-related distress in pancreatic cancer patients. Welcome, welcome, Dr. Lucas.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. You were instrumental in some of the early development of this, and so it's nice to come full circle and be able to talk a little bit more about it. Should I share my slides now? Perfect. So
whenever you're ready. Yep.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Excellent. Hi, thank you very much. Let me just jump in with some basics here. Don't try this at home. Anytime you talk about psychedelics, you have to remind people that even though it's very common to hear a lot about it in the press these days, they are still Schedule I substances. They're currently under investigation. They haven't been approved for anything, even though MDMA seems to be getting very close. The substances are still illegal in most communities, even though they are they have some interesting legal distinctions in a couple of states and localities, and they're very powerful agents. They're some of the most powerful agents we have because they change our perceptions of reality in the long and the short terms. They can have frightening effects, and they shouldn't be used without skilled guidance. So that's my safety disclaimer. My second disclaimer is that I work for VA. I do not speak for VA. And that just means that all of these things are my opinion, and the VA is not coming out and saying this. So have no fear. Even though very excitingly, the VA just announced about $10 million in funding for psychedelic research. The RFA is out now. So we're working on our ability to go ahead and participate in that. And the Omaha VA, it just since I actually turned in that um, bio, we have been selected as a site for a phase 3 trial of psilocybin for major depressive disorder. So I'm very excited about that as well. The third disclaimer is I'm balancing hype and hope. My job as a human being who has seen some really amazing results in patients and in the results of my colleagues, I'm very excited about the potential this has. At the same time, I'm deeply worried about some of the magic bullet thinking and some of the work that's going on that might not be as scrupulous as it should be. So I have a lot of hope for the field, and I think we need to be taking everything with our good skeptical lens and making sure we're doing the right things for the right people at the right time. Um, my background, I think, is a little interesting for people who might be on the call because it's been a long, strange trip to get to this point. I grew up in Omaha, in South Omaha, where very immigrant oriented community. Went to Catholic high school in the 70s where like good girls don't do things like this. But I always thought those friends of mine who talked about it, I thought those colors sounded really interesting, and didn't hear about anything for the field of psychedelics in general for a long time. When I went back to medical school, or in the time before medical school, when I was doing all my pre-med prerequisites, I had to do 2.5 years of science classes because I had already I did it as a post-bac. And so to stay sane, I took a minor in philosophy and religion. And in that time, learned about Native American spiritualities, indigenous communities, shamanism, supernatural phenomena, and how people interpret those things. And actually learned about the thousands of year old history of plant medicines, ways of changing consciousness, either through ingesting certain plants, fungi, or some animal products that have been going on for thousands of years of human culture, as well as different ways of changing consciousness, whether it's through being a whirling dervish or being a sun dancer up at a Sundance, or being a monk fasting in a cave for 40 days. So there are all kinds of ways of changing consciousness, and these are often done in the context of healing or healing ceremonies. Again, didn't hear about it for years afterwards. And then when I was living in Baltimore, uh, Johns Hopkins announced that they were going to do the first therapeutic trial of psilocybin in 40 years. It was very exciting. And this was going back and forth in the palliative medicine community because the population of interest were people with cancer. And so we talked about it a lot, and we were sharing emails. And lo and behold, I got a Google ad in 2011. I got a Google ad that said Hopkins researchers recruiting subjects for psilocybin and spirituality study. And while I was too uptight in high school to do anything that people might have been doing in the along in the forest along the Platte River in 1980 or in the 1980s, by the time it was in the 2000 teens, and I was thinking like, in a lab at Johns Hopkins, how bad could it be? So I put my hand up and participated in this trial where I met some of the people who were doing groundbreaking work at that time, and got to know them well, and almost got involved with their actual research group. But then my mom called and said, turning 80 years old, come back home. So I moved back to Omaha thinking my career as a psychedelic scientist was all but over, because I couldn't imagine that this work was going on in the middle of the country. And shortly after moving here, I got a phone call from an oncologist saying, hey, there's a philanthropist in my office who wants to know why they aren't doing this work here in Omaha. They said, we're giving them all kinds of chemotherapy. Why aren't we thinking about people's minds? And he came across an article, and I heard you talking about this work. And so what did I talk to him? And now a couple of years later, we have a trial here at the UNMC for pancreas cancer. So it's been an interesting road, but my various perspectives that I picked up along the way have definitely influenced the way I approach the field. So my goal today is to introduce what I suspect for most of you from a scientific point of view might be a novel field, and to get an idea of what are the opportunities and why we're looking at this field with such interest. So, as a the word palliative means to relieve suffering, and to do so perhaps without actually affecting the actual underlying disease. So, maybe we're treating the pain and the depression related to cancer, but we're not treating the cancer itself. So, if we start with the question, what is suffering and how do we understand it? It's a good place to start. And for a lot of people, especially when you're thinking about people who are sick, we think of pain, and people say, "Oh, I never want to die in pain. That's so horrible." But interestingly, pain and suffering are not as closely related as we think. So at first, this person, even though they seem to be in excruciating pain, if I give them a little pain medicine in 5 minutes, like, oh, everything's fine, really. No, I got over that. That happens every once in a while. It's okay. There are other people who experience pain of this severity and like, God's purifying my body. I feel like my mind and my body are being purified. I'm suffering like Christ suffered. This is good for my spiritual development, even though my body is having a hard time with this. And then there are people who intentionally inflict these states. People, like I said, if you think about sun dancers who are up on the reservation, there are people who go through these ordeals of pain to intentionally shift consciousness to get to different parts of their mind and perhaps interact with aspects of spirituality that are not as available to us. And then, not to put too fine a point on it, but there's a pretty big BDSM community in the world, and they're inflicting physical discomfort for pleasure or for sexual interest. And so that spectrum of pain means very different things to very different people, depending upon what your context, what your meaning making is around it. So pain by itself and suffering are only partially aligned. There are many other phases of suffering. We see people suffering from things like PTSD, depression, anxiety, and it manifests as those kinds of mental health diagnoses. We see people withdrawing from their lives, unable to enjoy things, trying to divert themselves by taking medication, by taking substances of abuse, and trying to change the channel in their mind in some ways, and then sometimes even self-medicating to try to get out of these states where they're just suffering. But thinking about like what that suffering in is has been hard to put our hands on because it sort of defies diagnosis. I already talked a little bit about suffering is not pain, or not. There's a little overlap between pain and suffering, but they are certainly not the same things. And it's not any other physical symptom. We have the same response to uh, nausea or vomiting or shortness of breath. Some people have it and they don't suffer, and some people have a teeny little bit and they're completely overwhelmed by it. So that doesn't align too well. Um, and then we have mental health nomenclature, all of those things that I just mentioned, depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders, all of those things. Figuring out where one starts and the other one ends, and what's the difference between depression with anxiety and anxiety with depression, and maybe it's similar to things that people are experiencing with trauma, and maybe things that are similar to things that are experiencing with substance use disorders, so that we've given them nomenclature and we've divided them into categories, but it's not clear that those categories serve us well when we're thinking about suffering and thinking about treating the causes of suffering. So in that literature where people are beginning to talk about transdiagnostic categories and ways of addressing that, maybe there are several steps back in those neurological cycles, that before we come to diagnose people within specific categories, there are upstream processes that are happening that might lead to suffering. But the working definition I have as a palliative medicine doctor is that suffering is the not living that happens when people are unable to generate positive adaptive responses to adversity. It's when people are unable to move forward in their lives and find a way to overcome whatever that obstacle is. And to the outside eyes, that obstacle can be very small or it can be massively large. It depends entirely upon what that person's abilities are and what their reference points are and how uh, much their mind is able to adapt. So another way of saying this is that people are unable to update their internal reality model to cope with the changing external reality, that they have a story about themselves, they have a model in which a way in which the world works, and something has happened and it's beyond their ability to cope given the model that they currently have. But that kind of begs the question, well, what's reality? And what's this reality model? And it's far more complicated. And I know a lot of you are involved in in the neurosciences, so forgive me for trying to encapsulate this in one very colorful slide. But if we start with the idea that our knowledge of reality is comprised of perceptions that are produced by the brain's cortex. So we're certainly encountering an objective something out there, but the way humans know it, in the way that humans and perhaps higher primates and things have those kinds of thoughts, all those thoughts about it are arising from perceptions that are produced and processed through our cortex. And that cortex, that brain, is the most complex network in the universe. But in case you haven't noticed, it's locked inside the vault of your skull. So it doesn't have any direct experience of the outside world. And everything that's coming to it is coming through millions and millions of electrochemical impulses that are carried through nerves and through some hormones in our body to let us know what's going on both inside your body and in the world at large. Now, that input is entirely overwhelming, and our cortex, while being splendiferous in many ways, would be unable to cope with all of that input. We can't think quickly enough to process all of the input. We don't even have receptors for all of the input. And if you just think of, I'm coming to you today over Zoom. Many of you people are experiencing it over Bluetooth devices, but nobody's ever seen the Bluetooth other than like the little figurine or the little icon. We believe it's there, but none of us can perceive it in any meaningful way other than that. So there are lots of things in reality we can't even perceive. And there are many, many perceptions that start coming in through our senses that are filtered out along the way. So most of our brains, or a good deal of our brain's capacity, is actually spent filtering out things that are not necessary or not particularly important to us at the moment to make our way through the world. Then what we do with what does make it through is we can't keep thinking about it and keep perceiving it. We can't waste that much energy. So once we've perceived something, we kind of build a simplification, good enough version of reality that exists in our mind, and it's maintained by this delicate network of nerves and cells. And we use that network, that model that's created by the various connections that happen within our brains, and we use that model to navigate the world. So we're using a map that exists in our heads to navigate an external world that we only have passing real perceptions of. So it's almost like we've got our brain is creating a little Lego movie version of real life that's out there. And there's this real thing out there, but we're looking at a good enough model and we're working with it over time. And most of the time, that's plenty good. That's more than enough for us to get by. But it's also the same reason that when you go home and your partner says, I cut my hair 3 days ago and you haven't said a word, it's because you're dealing with the reality model that you took, 6 weeks ago when they got their haircut the last time. And it was a different haircut. And that's the picture you've got. And you haven't updated that model to reflect that change in reality. So the model is sometimes very useful because it's very efficient. And sometimes it isn't as accurate as it needs to be for us to really get through. And it's particularly important when we get surprised or we get thrown that our model is completely out of whack. So if we think about it from that caricature point of view, suffering can be like getting stuck in a story without a plot. If we're working with the Lego movie of our lives, we're in a movie that doesn't have a good plot. The plot's not moving forward. You can't figure it out. It doesn't make any sense anymore. You got halfway through. It's like I followed it up until here, and now I don't know what anybody's doing. Or that maybe you've shown up as as an actor and there's not a place for you in the script. There's a script, but your character isn't in it anymore. The way you understood yourself to be doesn't fit with what's going on, and you don't have a way forward. You don't have a meaningful story. You don't know how to knit in. You don't know even maybe who you are in light of where things are. And so you're really stuck in a rut. You don't know how to move forward. And that idea of being stuck in a rut is interesting because there's another concept called rumination, and it's a form of perseverative cognition that focuses on negative content, generally in the past and the present, and it results in emotional distress. And that gets towards this idea of transdiagnostic theories that this rumination can lead to depression and anxiety. So that it's got this common precursor and you're stuck in a rut, kind of, like you're in this spiral. And no matter how hard you try, you just are in that same track of like, I'm not good enough. I don't know what's going on here. Life is hopeless. I'm stupid. I'm whatever. And you can't get yourself out of it. And I thought it was well put by Bono back just a few years ago. You got stuck in a moment and now you can't get out of it. And that's kind of the trap people are in. They don't know where they are in their story, and they just keep like, I'm lost. I don't know what's going on. I can't make sense out of this. And they perseverate on that. And those are many of the things that lead to what we perceive of as suffering in my world of palliative medicine and in a lot of medical care and in mental health care. We see these same patterns. So, if you're following me on the idea of how I approach suffering, then let's switch gears a little bit and think about what are psychedelics, because it's not as easy to define as we think. The term psychedelic is being used. Previously, hallucinogens were used, and there are other ways of categorizing these. And it's a very loose definition because at this point, there are three primary classes of compounds that are completely different chemically and work on an entirely different set of receptors in our brains, but their downstream effects on neurological change seem to be similar. They share in common that currently they're all controlled substances of varying degrees. They produce an altered state of consciousness, and people seek that altered state of consciousness, which is why they are controlled substances. Um, but their effects, their subjective and objective effects are quite different. And the three categories that we are dealing with the most now are the dissociative agents, and ketamine is the main agent that we work with. It's available currently now. We use it in ERs all the time for sedation, but at subsedative levels, it produces psychedelic effects. And if you are one of the people who has learned about using ketamine, they'll say, oh, you can use it with kids, it's just fine, but you give it to adults and they wake up and they're all squirrely. Well, if you woke up in the middle of a psychedelic state and you weren't expecting it, you would be squirrely too. So the thing that people are experiencing is that weirdness is just their psychedelic effects that hadn't been really appreciated until more recently, and we're using them therapeutically now. So while there are uh, protocols for sub-psychedelic dosing that we use in infusion practices for depression, there's a range that's higher than that, but lower than sedation, where the psychedelic effects happen. And those seem to be more therapeutic in terms of using it with a psychedelic assisted therapy. And so those kinds of things are available now, and there are a limited number of practitioners who are using that, but the evidence base is still pretty scant. But you will certainly hear about those agents. Then there are agents called entactogens or empathogens, and MDMA is the primary molecule there. And colloquially on the street, it would be known as ecstasy or Molly. Um, but it has gone through rigorous testing now, and the phase 3 trials were completed last year, and the sponsor has filed a new drug application with the FDA. And there was actually just an update yesterday that I did not get to see, so I don't know exactly where we are. But there's I would say an 80% chance that the FDA is going to give us some access to MDMA this year, and it might be clinically available next year. And its main indication at this point is for PTSD, because its method of action is by turning down the volume on the amygdala. So your fear responses are high, and it creates these high degrees of relationship and trust. And so it's perfect for PTSD because people have these memories that they can't process because they're too frightening, and they tend to not trust people. So you're never in a therapeutic relationship that's good enough to get you there. But you put some MDMA with that, and you have the right kind of counseling protocol, and people have amazing breakthroughs and do a great deal of healing. So my guess is that not only is it going to be useful for PTSD, but in my line of work in palliative medicine, where people are so terrified of the fact that their lives are in danger and that they might have to undergo really challenging treatments, I think we're going to see great benefit for people working in those categories. But the class of drugs that I am most interested in, where my research is focused, are in the tryptamine or serotonin-based psychedelics. And psilocybin is the one that we know the most about from a scientific point of view. But the other drugs in the same category would include LSD and DMT as well. And we expect that those will probably be rescheduled in probably 27, if maybe 26, but probably 27, if the current research continues at the same pace with the same results that we have been getting thus far. And interestingly, It works on all kinds of things, and the more we test, the more it looks like we get response. But the current indication that is being sought is for depression, both major depressive disorder and PTSD. We think the next will be for substance use disorder, and beyond that, we will be using it for many interesting things, and we'll talk about that in a bit more. But it's interesting that there are these three entirely different agents. Chemically, they look entirely different from each other, all produce similar downstream effects in our brain. So just to contextualize this a little bit more and to give you an idea that these agents are ubiquitous in nature, every single place on earth has a place where you could get to some kind of plant medicine. So this is a rye plant, and this nasty stuff here is called rye ergot, and they think that that's what led to a lot of maybe like the Eleusinian mystery cults in ancient Greece. There are things that occurred in old time Europe that is probably a result of this, and this is what we derive LSD from, or not. It's the model agent for LSD and where we came up with this. This is a peyote cactus where mescaline is derived. These two things are the root and the bark of plants that grow in the Amazon area, and that's what ayahuasca is made from. So you hear people going down to South America to do ayahuasca journeys. And actually, I think a few months ago there was a lawyer who was arrested for brewing up his own here in Omaha. So it's definitely around. Probably not those exact plants, but a similar brew. This is a little toad, the Sonoran desert toad, and these little glands behind his eyes secrete a substance that makes 5-MeO-DMT. Which is an agent that is being investigated now, possibly for a depressive disorder as well. This orange plant is from Africa, from Gabon, and this is the iboga tree, and this gives rise to ibogaine, which has a lot of interest from people who are studying heroin addiction and other opioid addictions because of its particularly long-acting nature. It appears to be able to overcome some of the problems that people are having getting over opioid disorders, and it's quite effective. We're beginning to understand how it's effective. So these are all the natural agents, and there are many more natural agents that it fit in, and then they're synthesized readily in labs. MDMA is not produced by any plant or animal that we know of, and this is what the study substance looks like. I don't know what it will look like when it's actually produced for commercial use. And this is ketamine that you can find in every ER and in many other places in America. And both of these are relatively new agents. This was synthesized initially in the 60s, and this was synthesized in the 80s. But that brings me to my good friend psilocybin. Um, it's the magic in magic mushrooms. It's used ceremonially for centuries, if not millennia. There's some reasonable data that suggests that we have human evidence of ritualistic use as far back as 7,000 years ago. It is produced by these psilocybe mushrooms. There are about 200 genus that grow all over the world. And if you were to eat those, or to extract the psilocybin out of them, or to synthesize it, you would come up with a serotonin analog that looks just like this. Here's the psilocybin, here's serotonin, and you can see that they have very minor differences from a chemical point of view. And because of that, they nestle very comfortably here. This is the serotonin 2A receptor, or the 5-HT2A receptor, which happens to be the receptor on serotonergic neurons. That's sort of the gas pedal for um, those neurons. And because it's a selective serotonin receptor agonist, it turns the gas on in the cell. The 1A receptor is not affected nearly as much, so the brake's not really involved. But what's interesting is that because of this subtle difference in the chemical structure, it changes the conformation of that receptor protein slightly, and that receptor reaches over and it grabs another receptor. And I want to say it's a glutamate receptor, but I'm not going to lie to you and say I remember exactly what it is now, but it pulls that one over, and that happens to be the cell's emergency brake. That if the cell were firing too long, that would be the receptor that would kind of send signals saying we've been going at this too long, you should stop now. So it's selectively pushing on the brake, and it's hijacked. The molecule is selectively pressing on the gas pedal while at the same time holding on to the emergency brake, so we can't depress it. So now we've got this highly activated serotonergic system. And that initiates a cascade of neurological activation that has profound downstream impacts far, far away from their original receptors. And just the red areas in these MRIs are indicating where in the cortex, we see the most of these receptors. But based on other research from other agents, we know it's not the receptor action that's leading to the downstream. It's not leading to the downstream therapeutic changes. So we're learning a lot about how this is working on a cellular level, and that's really one of the interesting areas of research down the line. And so the way that I think about it, and of course this is not to scale, you've got your little psilocybin molecule that's stimulating these serotonergic neurons, and two things are happening at the same time, and kind of on two different levels of awareness of our minds. On one level, we're getting neuronal activation, and it's causing that psychedelic trip. We're seeing an imbalance in the way that we're creating those reality models in the short term, and we're experiencing really intense phenomena of um, that give us all the rise of, like, every black light poster, every album cover from the 60s, every Fish concert, all of those things that you hear about of the psychedelic trip are formed from that. And at the same time, those same neurons are activating that neural network, and way downstream, we're seeing changes in neuroplasticity that seem to be mediated by changes in extracellular membrane at this point, and it's changing the plasticity and the metaplasticity of those neurons over the long term. So even though this psychedelic trip only lasts a long time, it gives rise to stories and ways for us to continue to engage our cortex in that storytelling, meaning making. And then if you continue to do that in the face of this this neuroplasticity, those neuroplastic changes last quite a while. For ketamine, it probably lasts a few days. For psilocybin, it probably lasts more like several weeks to a month. LSD is a little bit longer than that. And ibogaine, we don't know, but it's probably months. So if you engage in this process of meaning making using these stories, and it's acting on these with this new sort of neuroplasticity, there's a sense that perhaps the brain has a way of coming up with more adaptive changes. And so hopefully that gives you a little bit of the mechanistic nature from a Western scientific point of view, how we look at this. If we were looking at this from a shamanic lens, they would have entirely different stories that they would say why these medicines are effective. And depending upon what your lens, you will find different ways to work with them. But now let's switch gears and think about, so what does the psychedelics have to do with the suffering that we started with? Well, one concept is that there's a decrease in default mode network activity. So the default mode network is the resting state is there's a great phrase that says this is where your mind goes to wander. When you are not thinking or not focusing on something in the external world, this is where your mind is in sort of that resting state. And we believe that's where we hold our image of ourself, our self story, our sense of identity, and those collective stories that make us who we are. Interestingly, in the presence of psilocybin, this is done in functional MRI, what we see are deactivation of this network. So people originally thought we were going to see a huge upregulation in the perceptual areas, and that's what what was leading to all those perceptual changes. And we see a little bit for a little while, but it's not nearly as striking as these changes in the default mode network. So the concept is that if you deactivate that area for a while, perhaps it's loosening some of the connections that we hold of this sense of selves. And they've given rise to this theory called rebus, or relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. And it's a hypothesis that fixed stories are relaxed so that new ones can be constructed. So it maybe is just loosening those connections enough that it's able to be reworked in a way that is not being able to be reworked in normal states of consciousness. Another idea that comes to us from studies of functional neuroimaging is this idea in increased cross-network connectivity, or another phrase for this is reduced modularity. And I have to say, I'm speaking way over my pay grade in terms of understanding this. And some of you may understand these works much more. But this is basically a caricature of the connections between functional brain networks. So the colors represent specific networks, and then the dots within the colors are specific nodes within those functional networks. And then what we can see is that there are really dense and multiple connections within those sectors, and your brain's doing that all the time. And occasionally there are things that relate one functional network to another, but there aren't that many, and they are used obviously and connected over time. And the way I tend to be a very metaphorical thinker. So I imagine, like, as a child, this was probably much more populated, and then over time, we clipped a lot of those because they didn't work. Like, once you learn how to tie your shoes, all the paths that cross connect here that don't tie your shoes appropriately go away. So over time, we develop a very efficient model of what connections we need to keep and which connections we don't need to maintain. So this is what the normal resting state looks like. When we take away the blinds and at peak psilocybin experience, it looks like this. So this explains pretty well if you're getting all of these connections between these functional brain networks. If we're looking at auditory circuits connecting, auditory centers connecting with visual centers, connecting with sensory centers, like all of a sudden you can see why those synesthesias and why you would be seeing these very different things. But what the theory behind this is that and then, of course, when the psilocybin has worn off in a few hours, the connections look much more like this. But the idea that people are beginning to play with is that perhaps by repopulating these connections and allowing your brain to think, oh, now I can imagine what it would be like instead of relying this as my sole circuit from this network to this network. Oh, maybe there are other ways I could get there. And maybe that's a way of getting out of those ruts. Maybe they're out of these cognitive ruts. And being able to allow us to relax some of that perseveration and some of the maladaptive patterns that we may have been stuck in. So again, we're very early in understanding this. And because we've only had real legal access for maybe a solid decade where we've had good access from a research point of view, and it's still very difficult to do. And we've only had the techniques that really allow us to get this deep for short decades. So we're really primed to learn so much more about the way our brains understand reality and the way we frame these things. So again, if we take that same silly caricature that I had from the beginning, so if we say now we've got these stories and we're going to allow the stories to influence, we're going to keep activating these networks, and these networks are now a little bit more plastic. Perhaps we have a little bit more ability to be creative. So if we started out with our little Lego movie, this is our reality model, and we've got the the little cowboy with the camera, and I think this is like the little saloon girl, she's mixing up her beverage at the cowboy bar. If that's the model you've got going on, and it's not quite working for where you are, well, maybe under the influence of psychedelics, your brain's like, maybe you showed up in a cowboy hat, but maybe next time you're going to be the villain. Maybe you're going to the white hat here, but maybe if I change my story and I'm a different character, what if I can expand my sense of who I am? Or perhaps I'm more able to see what tools are available to me. Maybe I can pick up, I don't need that camera. The camera isn't working anymore. Maybe the pitchfork's going to do me more good. So maybe it gives us a few more choices. And we see that manifest in something called cognitive flexibility that we'll get to later. So it's just sort of a way to think about a simplified version of how these might be working to improve some of the difficulties that people are facing. Just to summarize the data very quickly, because I know most of you are not palliative medicine doctors or practitioners, the work in my field is outstanding, and it's some of the most interesting work that the FDA looked at. So there were two fundamental trials that started in 2016. And they tested just under 100 people who had a significant mental health diagnosis, depression, anxiety, demoralization, who also had a potentially terminal cancer. Of the people who engaged in the psilocybin protocol, and this was a double-blind randomized controlled trial, 70% of the people almost immediately after their dosing had a clinically significant reduction in symptoms, at least a 50% reduction in their depressive or anxious symptoms. And of those people, 50% had complete remission of those diagnoses. They no longer qualified for the diagnosis, and they no longer felt any symptoms of the diagnosis. And what's interesting is that it was true shortly after the experience. And you'd say, yeah, they're still high. Of course, they're going to feel good. But it tests positive at 6 weeks later, and it's slightly stronger 6 months later after a single dose of approximately 25 to 35 milligrams of psilocybin taken once in 1 day session. They were the largest effect sizes ever seen from in mental health researchers research, far greater than anything that we've seen for any SSRI, any MAO, any of those things. So they were really exceptional. And when they took these results to the FDA to move forward, the FDA said you can't limit this research to cancer patients. You've got to take it to depression writ large, because right now we don't have anything that works anywhere near this. And so if you've got anything approaching these levels, we would have something that was far superior to what's on the market. So that's why right now the trials are focused on depression as opposed to looking only at cancer-related things. But what's interesting is, like, we're probably all aware there are many people who are like, yeah, my symptoms like look better when I look at this, screening survey that I'm taking, and the numbers are lower, but my life still doesn't make any sense, but I can get out of bed in the morning. What's different about the psilocybin work is people say this was one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. They're beautiful stories, and I'll tell you some of the ones that I've heard in my trial. Now, of note, these are the results from the cancer trials, and the initial response that we're seeing in major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression are different, and they are not as good, which gives us this idea that those categories that we have in mental health are not as useful or as accurate as we sometimes think. Um, and the new trials are testing different modalities of giving it. And we see basically a third of people who respond well, a third of people who respond but don't continue their response, and a third of people who don't get a response from one dose. So now we're kind of playing with, well, what is the right dosing, and how do we determine who responds and who doesn't respond? And there's an appendix for citations if you want some more information on this. But that brings me to my trial, which is the palliadelic treatment for the distress related to advanced GI cancers. And I'd like to give a shout out to my co-investigators, Kelsey Clutie, who is the GI oncologist, Jody Kellis, who's the chair of communication studies at UNL, and Sunju Wong, who is the professor at our Department of Psychiatry and who is working on the fMRI work for us. And this is a feasibility trial with a multi-method assessment of impact. And so basically, we've got a feasibility trial with 12 cancer patients and their partners. Only the patient is getting the psilocybin. There are, however, other people who are doing conjoint treatment, which is going to be very interesting. But I'm doing 12 cancer patients. And it's feasibility. We're looking at, can we actually make the intervention work? Can we train all the people, get all the right things, all the right licenses in the right places? And can we recruit and retain people for the trials? The secondary outcomes are distress and well-being. So we're looking at demoralization, depression, and anxiety, as well as positive and negative affect. And then a battery of tests for well-being, of spiritual, mental health, well-being, and thriving. Then from an exploratory point of view, we're looking at, these are just pre-post, what are the outcomes from the mental health diagnosis point of view. But we're looking longitudinally at those to see how do they change over the course of a year. And people with pancreas cancer tend to live around a year. So we're going to capture them when they're having probably very challenging experiences. So we're going to see how durable their responses are over time, looking at what the family impact is like, how people are able to cope and communicate throughout this, and then looking at healthcare utilization and decision making. So what we're going to have is some feasibility data about how well we're able to do this and what kind of tweaks we need to make to the protocol. But we're going to have some really interesting, it's a multi-method case study of how different families are coping with this serious illness, and what does putting a powerful psychedelic experience into the middle of that do for or to those families. Again, feasibility, we're looking at recruitment rates, retention, and do people experience the phenomena? Are they experiencing these things that are associated with serotoninergic agents? And then the secondary outcomes are here. And um, more interesting, I think, is what's going on for the patient and what makes it so different from standards of treatment. And standard of care at this point would be to give people SSRIs and get them some counseling. And we have to say that the results are, if you have great counseling and you respond well to the SSRIs, you do well, but that's not the majority of people who are facing these problems. So the patient experience is interesting because first, of course, you have to assure that there's a good fit between the person and the protocol. They have to be well enough. They can't have major psychiatric disorders like schizophrenic disorders or bipolar 1 or 2 that would lead to problems with potential psychosis or mania. So we have to screen people and make sure it fits this protocol. Then we do preparation with them because a powerful psychedelic experience is overwhelming, and if you're not prepared for it, could be potentially terrifying. So we spend several hours of counseling about the experience. That's usually done over 4 to 6 hours, over 2 or 3 days, and it's spread out over about a week. We give them some homework to work on in between, and we hope to give them some basic flight rules about what happens and some skills to navigate a non-ordinary state of consciousness to get the most out of it while they're involved in it. And in case I haven't spoken about it clearly, the doses we're using are high doses. People talk a lot about microdosing. These are nowhere near microdoses. There are certainly higher doses available, but these are a deep psychedelic experience in which people think that they are in an entirely different world, at least when their eyes are closed. Then we go into a dosing session where people look something like this. They're brought into a comfortable environment. We put on a specific playlist. We put on eye shades, and we give them the medicine. And in about 30 minutes, they start experiencing the initial symptoms. And over 6 hours, they will say that they would not know they were in Nebraska anymore. When they open their eyes, they can orient to the world, and we take them to the bathroom and bring them back, put them back in, and they continue to experience this altered state of consciousness. At the end of about 6 hours, they are back to consensus reality, and they are able to go home with a family member or someone who can get them safely home. Uh, People go out and have dinner. They're usually pretty quiet because they've gone through so much, but they're in a normal state of consciousness. They often have some interesting dreams that night, but they're perfectly able to stay at home by themselves if they needed to. Um, and then they come in the next morning and they do their first integration session, and they just usually download everything that has happened to them. And then we debrief and we help them begin to start making sense of it and to start building those stories to reflect on the memories of what happened and see if we can engage in that neuro processing and the neuro connectivity that we've been talking about. And we think about weaving the extraordinary into the ordinary. And then in our trial, we follow them for a year. So every a month for a year, they fill out some surveys and they get a short interview to get a sense of what's going on. So on the outside, people look like this. If you were to look at the videos, people look like this, and they're just sitting there not doing too much. On the inside, it could look like absolutely anything. And you might get up out of the bed that you think that you've been lying on and walk into a magic world. And no one can describe a psychedelic experience if you haven't had one. So the common experiences and outcomes that we measure, one of them is called a mystical experience, and it's categorized as having a sense of sacredness, positive mood. It's outside of time and space, and it's noetic, in that people feel like they have this sense of knowing. People experience deep senses of awe, emotional breakthrough, connectedness, cognitive flexibility, and again, the sense that it's the most personally meaningful experience that they have had. And all of those top items that I mentioned all have validated measures to help us get a sense of how different people are impacted on those scales. And you can see these correlate much more with spiritual domains than they do with psychological domains. The cognitive flexibility is pretty psychological, but the rest of these follow far more into a spiritual domain than they tend to in a psychological domain. One of my patients with pancreas cancer said, Dr. Lucas, in one afternoon, I realized I'd been living my life in a utility closet. And I opened the door and I found an amphitheater. The same play is always going on the stage. It's my life, but I can choose what seat I sit in. I don't have to look at it in one way. I can look at it in the balcony, and from there, people look different. I can see that there's another set off stage, and I can see something else. I can come down and sit up close, and I get a really intense view, but I can choose where I am, and I can choose. And that's that example of being able to pick perspectives and having more cognitive flexibility. He had an enormous emotional breakthrough where he found a little boy who had really suffered in his youth that he had all but lost track of in his adulthood. And he said beautifully, like, the greatest tool I found was me. I'm the instrument. The harmony or the disharmony is being created within me. It's my choice. I can create it. And just that sense of agency in the face of serious illness. And we've done follow-up work with him. And he says, I've had some challenging results, but sometimes I'm the only person in the room whose hair isn't on fire. And he gave us a specific example where he was able to help his oncologist actually untangle some confusing results and actually found that he was not having a progression of illness and did not need to start chemotherapy. And if he had not had that sense of flexibility and calmness in the face of that, he said he would have been started on chemotherapy for no good reason at that point. And so just that ability to think clearly and maintain a sense of calm in the face of adversity was really impressive. But more impressive to me, and I've seen this overlay now in many patients, is there's two kinds of okay. Cancer patients typically say, I'm okay. And they're okay because they're armored up. They are defended. They're going to fight this. And that's fine. And it's getting them through. And it's a coping pattern. But that armor is heavy. It's hard to carry, and it's hard to get through. So they have a harder time connecting with their own emotions and with other people. What my patients are telling me is that there's another kind of okay. It's where I am really okay. I don't need the armor. I can get through this. I can be strong. I can be flexible. I can be nimble, and I can be okay without all that extra baggage. And I think when we're offering this to cancer patients, it's an amazing thing that we would be able to offer, because just the ability to cope, even with treatment that could be successful and lead to cure, it's still a lot to go through. So I think that we have a lot of opportunity to improve the lives of cancer patients. And so when we think then with what do we have to do with research? Well, it's boundless at this point. We're just about to get legal access to MDMA, which will make research ever so much easier. And so we'll be able to see part of the portfolio that will really expand with that drug. Uh, but when we think about what we can do just with psilocybin and the tryptamine agents, it's a lot. There's so much work to do. So I started writing the protocol for this before COVID, and then it took a little while because being a palliative medicine doctor in COVID kind of took a little bit of my time. But when I did my initial lit search and I went into clinicaltrials.gov and registered my trial, there were about 27 registered psychedelic trials. Today, I just checked, there were 571 trials in clinicaltrials.gov, looking at various forms of depression, PTSD, substance use disorders of different kinds, alcohol, tobacco, methamphetamine, cocaine specifically, looking at well aging and adaptability, looking at eating disorders, interesting obsessive compulsive disorder, clinician burnout. There's a really interesting researcher in um, up in Washington State who was originally a palliative medicine doctor, but when he saw what COVID did to the healthcare field, he said, "I want to do that work with healthcare providers," and they're getting fascinating and similar results from healthcare providers. People are looking at long COVID and long Lyme, where you can see the overlap of both the neurological changes that might happen and the psychological changes that might happen as a result, and various forms of chronic pain, including various forms of headache disorder. Um, so, and I alluded earlier to there's huge clinical work to be done, but there's so much preclinical work to be done to look at. We don't really understand how the mind is creating consciousness at any given time. So this gives us tools to work with to adjust that, and there's lots of cellular work, there's animal work, there's lots of interesting computational neurobiology work that's going on that again is above my pay grade. But with this introduction, I would love to hear what you guys think about this and what kind of questions you might have, and maybe if you have any interest, because as I said, right now the VA has money available for research, and because a lot of this research has been done on the coasts, we don't know how people in the middle of America are going to, whether this reflects the kinds of problems that people here have and the kinds of consciousness. Are people going to want to do this? So we're going to be looking at putting together for something to really focus on rural populations. So perhaps there are potential collaborators here who would be interested in working with that. So with that, I am done with that part of the presentation, and I would love to hear your feedback.
Don't see any questions in the chat, but Roxanne, looks like you have a question. Your hand's up.
Yes, I'm trying to unmute here. Thank you, Dr. Lukas. You and I have talked a little bit before. I have just a couple minor, they're physiological questions, which is out of my field, but just in terms of a little longer term, is there data regarding frequency of use? I know there obviously are developing protocols, and that's got to happen in terms of interventions, but repeated interventions, I'm thinking, if that's something that's in the research world at this point. And then the other has to do with when I think about neuroplasticity, I also think about genetic change, and I'm wondering if there's any conversation about longer term or genetic
Sure.
changes.
Sure. So we think about those in a couple of different ways. So first, I would divide genetic and epigenetic. So genetic, there's no change in no one's genes, or no one's germline is being changed as a result of doing this. And we've now got both thousands of years of colloquial use and dozens of years of knowing that there plenty of people in America have done this, and there's no evidence of any teratogenicity, any of those things. Epigenetically, there's absolutely changes going on. The way we are expressing genes is going on, and that is why and the work that I've seen to really elucidate what's causing that metaplasticity changes, and they've narrowed it down. It looks like it's a change in the transcription level in genes that are coding for extracellular matrix, and the extracellular matrix appears to be degraded and then repaired, and in that repair, it just is more plastic. It's more able to it's sort of like you put I'll give my metaphors. It's a fresh coat of paint. You're just able to move a little bit differently. So from an epigenetic point of view, we're definitely seeing changes in transcription that's going on as a result of some of those changes. And it's interesting because there's data around trauma being transmitted in an epigenetic fashion. And so perhaps there's a way to work with that. People are understanding that again, the very beginning of understanding how to ask those questions and develop the protocols to see how they work. From a multiple use point of view, we're just now, the work unfortunately is extremely expensive. And in the research environment, like if you just had synthetic psilocybin and some therapists, you could do some good work. But when you've got to pile a whole research infrastructure on top of it, it can get quite expensive. And so it's very difficult to do those trials given all the constraints we have. We do have now, there are trials that are dose finding trials where we will see people like in the alcohol use disorder work, we'll give people an initial dose of 25 milligrams. If that suits them and they want to go up, they can go up for another dose. And then there's a third possible dose that they could go up higher. So they could have 3 increasing dose or 3 of the same dose, depending upon where they wanted to go. So we have evidence from those kinds of trials, and people do well. And then we have SCADs, there's probably 1,000 people who've been through scientific trials. There are several million people who have been to following the dead and fish, who've been, doing psilocybin every week for the last 10 years. And they're mostly fine. Like if you've been doing psilocybin every week for the last 10 years, you're probably a little different to start with, but we don't see any long-term changes that happen to people who are of right mind. Now, if you are a person who had psychotic features and you did this, might cause problems. If you have a tendency towards mania, we're a little bit worried about that. And Dr. Larson asks if there are bad reactions to the experience. And so bad reactions are very interesting in what we think of as a bad reaction. So there's 2 ways of looking at that, and we distinguish them very carefully. So one, if anybody's of a certain age, like me, you remember people talking about bad trips. And a bad trip is what happens when you are not prepared for a psychedelic experience. Psychedelic experiences are powerful. They can be frightening. They can get you into scary places. If you're not ready for them, if you're not adequately supported, if you're not in a safe environment, you can completely freak out. And that's a bad trip. And we do not see that in the site. When we're working with people in these kinds of trials, people don't freak out. They are prepared. We've worked with them very carefully. We have called out the people who are like, you know what, I think you have too much anxiety. You would need more treatment of your anxiety before coming into this trial because I don't have enough time in the trial to work with you. You could work with those people with these agents, but it would take longer than we usually have in these clinical trials. So the quote bad trip that is kind of a picture of that people have from a certain point of history, we don't see that. What we do see within experiences is that they can be quite challenging. people have lots of things in their minds that they have kept under the rug for a long time. So people can surface, I relived my mother's death, or, one of my friends actually experienced she had experienced the death of a newborn. It's like, I was holding my dead baby in my hands. Like, so you can imagine the weeping and the sorrow and just processing all of that. And so it's challenging, and the pain that these people can be in acutely in that moment can seem overwhelming, but we bring them through those experiences and they say, I needed those tears more than you could imagine. And there are people who will say, like, I felt the weight of slavery. I felt the millions of slaves who died on ships on their way to America. And I cried I cried for the planet. And they cried maybe for hours. And so you would say, like, oh, you had a really hard time. They think, oh no, I feel like I'm purified. I feel much different. So even if you've had challenging experiences, people again, with the appropriate support, seem to do fine, and they even have positive therapeutic findings. So they might have had this deep sorrow experience, but they experience good results in their objective scores. What we are learning more and more about is there are a small number of people who have downstream impacts that are much more subtle and that we're just learning really how to screen for. We have not seen many of these in the clinical trials, but there may be clinical trials whose adverse event screening mechanism was either not long enough or not sensitive enough to detect it. But we are seeing it with the growing number of people who are in environments where maybe we don't know exactly what they took or how much they took, or they might be in an environment that might not have been conducive. And they have this sense of derealization. It's a very small number, but that the pilot, Alaska Airlines pilot, that you might have heard about, who tried to take a plane down. That's real. And there are people like, oh, no, that didn't have anything to do with the psilocybin. It was out of his system. It's like, well, no, the psilocybin did not do that. But what happened is that you had a patient who had long-term untreated depression, who should have done work around that depression, and then should not have gone to camp with his buddies and said, here, buddy, have some mushrooms. They're supposed to be good for you. And then had no follow-up, and then be on a plane. And then have this experience of, like, he was in a dream he couldn't get out of. And that's exactly, like, nothing about that was appropriate. And that's possible. So we have to be careful. So 3 flavors of bad experiences and how we help with those.
How about any other questions from anybody? Well, we look like we're at the top of 1 o'clock, about 30 seconds. So boy, this has been fantastic. We really appreciate your time today. Lou, it's been great. It was a
Thank
great
you.
entertaining talk.
Thank you.
Different
Well,
perspectives.
yes. Well, I look forward to working with y'all, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.